We have mostly regulars, but we've got a couple of newer people here tonight. So I'll just say I'm Sue Rockwell. I'm co-chair of the book group. Thanks to Sarah McDonough from the Historical Society for hosting the meeting for us and getting us on technologically. So we welcome all of you. This is the first session of this particular season of the book group. And it looks like at least several of them are going to be by Zoom. So I'm glad that you're all able to join us in this technology. Sorry that we couldn't serve you food. Hopefully you had a good dinner yourselves. I'm going to turn it over to Joan at this point. Joan Pagliuca is the co-chair of the book group, and I'm going to let her get us started.
Okay, so Sarah, will you just give us a few housekeeping hints before we get started as to, how we answer and what we should not do?
Sure. So luckily with sort of a small group tonight, it won't be as chaotic as when people are on multiple screens. But basic, I think most of us have been on a Zoom call at this point, but just know if you got to take a phone call or anything like that, you guys have figured out where the mute button is now. And if once the discussion gets kind of crazy, it helps if folks have a question or a comment to either raise your hand physically or to use one of the little buttons on the bottom of the screen, which has a little, well, let's see, it doesn't have the raise hand, but it has a little thumbs up, so you can use that. Mm-hmm. If you want to agree with somebody.
It's easier to just raise your hand, I think.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so our book tonight is about Benjamin Rush.
Judy.
The title.
Hi, Judy.
The title is Revolution, Madness, and the Visionary Doctor Who Became a Founding Father. We're talking about the Benjamin whose face is not gracing the $100 bill. We're talking about the other Benjamin. So the author is Stephen. Now, I don't know if it's Fried or Freed. So since he's not here, he can't correct me. So our author, Stephen Freed or Fried, I'm not sure how he pronounces it. He'll forgive me somewhere out there, I'm sure. He is an award-winning journalist, a New York best-selling author. He teaches at Columbia University and the University of Pennsylvania. He has written 7 acclaimed nonfiction books, and this one is his latest. And before I hand it over to our leader tonight, I'd like to present Dick Newmeier. He and his wife, Mary, have resided in Lexington since 1979. He is a semi-retired trial and appellate lawyer with a very, very keen interest in history. So Dick, take it away.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So, yeah. Well, actually, let me just add that when I was in high school, I thought I would be a high school history teacher. And then when I got to college, I thought I would be a college history professor. But when I graduated, I didn't know what to do, so I went to law school. But I've always been interested in history, and I must say I've read a lot about it, and I've never heard of Dr. Rush or this author before. But it was a fascinating book. This is a doctor who had quite a reputation as a doctor. He was also interested in politics, and he was a very prolific writer. I was interested to learn that when he shows up at the Continental Congress at age 28, the youngest person there, Adams tells him, John Adams, don't utter the word independence. Apparently that was too revolutionary a thing to talk about. Given the fact that we've had the corona crisis for some time, I was also fascinated by all the epidemics of yellow fever and all of the things that took place that killed so many people over a period of time. 1793 yellow fever epidemic, and hundreds died. And what's the solution of this? The medical solution is bloodletting. take out the person's blood. And that was a solution to many medical problems.
Yeah.
It was just an interesting approach, at least, he helped found the Society for Inoculating the Poor in 1774 to help stop the spread of smallpox. More than 300 people died in Philadelphia out of the city's 1,334 deaths. That's an enormous quantity. It's even greater than what we're looking at today. I was also interested in the medical advice he gave to the soldiers. Change your clothes,
Yeah.
especially socks. Eat more vegetables, Wash your hands and faces. Drink less alcohol. He wrote I call it a book, but it was actually a pamphlet, I'm sure, an inquiry into the effects of spirituous liquors on the human body and their influence upon the happiness of society. Now, of course, one of the reasons people used alcohol back then was we didn't have readily available potable water all the time. So if you just drank water, in a city especially, it could be quite poisonous. And that was a reason to drink alcohol. Many people did. Of course, some people did too much of that. He also points out that with respect to lunatics, the remedy is lock them all up. And indeed, until about 40 or 50 years ago, that's the way we dealt with severely mentally impaired people. Another interesting thing to me is that he wanted public schools for children in Philadelphia in the 1780s and 90s. Now, in today's New York Times, in case you haven't read it, I'll tell you there's a story in the middle about the Littleton School Committee in the 1840s deciding there should be public education for students and that women should be hired to be the teachers because they would be much cheaper to pay than men. They were also qualified to teach, but it would save taxpayers a lot of money to hire women. And women, of course, over the years have been teachers for a majority of the time. He did not serve at the Constitutional Convention, but he did assist in the drafting of the Constitution. He did join the Free African Society and attended their dinner at a time when he had a malignant fever, which broke out on Water Street and killed a number of people. He almost died in 1788 of something else. And the most amusing thing to me again was he asked to be bled again to recover. As I say, he was a writer. He wrote a 363-page treatise, an account of the bilious yellow fever as it appeared in the city of Philadelphia in the year 1793. Now, even back then, that's probably more pages than most people were willing to or wanted to write. He married a woman, Julia, and it was interesting to note that in her 34th year, she became pregnant for the 12th time. I guess that's the way it was back then. But
Not all lived.
the yellow fever and the smallpox and the other things caused a number of deaths. I didn't know that the Attorney General of the United States, William Bradford Jr., died of malignant fever on August 23, 1795. But he did. And of course, George Washington contracted an infection after working on his farm in the rain. And what was the solution to this? What was the treatment? Bleed him.
Bloodletting. Yeah.
Bloodletting. That was the solution. And I've read elsewhere, though not in this book, that he probably died as a result of his doctor's treatment. Died at age 67, which is a very young age by contemporary standards. A treatise was published, that's what I would call it, 1,295 pages, Letters of Benjamin Rush. I haven't read it, but that says a lot about him. So here he was. He was a doctor. He was interested in politics. And he was active also in commenting on slavery and suggesting that it had to go. Now, when George Washington was elected president, the government met in Philadelphia. I think that's somewhere in the book, but not in the book is the fact that Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania had abolished slavery. And they had a law that said if you bring a slave into Philadelphia, into Pennsylvania, and that slave stays there for 6 months, that slave is free. Washington knew that law. And of course, he had to take his slaves with him to cook the food and take care of them. And he made sure that when he got near the 6-month period, he'd leave and go back to Virginia for a little bit and bring his slaves with him. But I do want to say something about Washington in terms of his attitude towards slavery. He grew up in Virginia, and when he was born, slavery was accepted everywhere there. And before the Revolution, he bought and sold slaves. After the Revolution, he never did that. Why is that significant? If you buy or sell a slave, you could break up a family. He was not willing to do this after the Revolutionary War. The other interesting thing about him, 2 other interesting things, is he was initially opposed to having slaves fight in the army. He changed his mind on that very quickly, frankly, because there was no alternative to accepting anybody that was willing to fight on our side, whether they're white, black, green, purple, whatever. If they could fight, he took them. We fought with an integrated army during the Revolution. The next time we would do that would be in the Korean War. Quite a gap. And then in the evening of his life, he takes his will and he throws it in the fireplace and burns it up. And we don't know what it said. And he writes out a new will, which says, upon my death and my wife's death, all of our slaves will be free. And he was perceived as a great leader at the time. And if others had followed his lead, things might have worked out differently. But Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson did not. Anyway, those are my thoughts for this evening. I'll be happy to answer any questions if anybody's got any questions or comments. And it was a great book, a great selection, very educational, very informative. I've read a lot about the Revolution and that time, and this told me a lot of things I did not know. So.
Hey, Joan.
The author, when you're talking about the fact that he owned the slave, his name was William Grubber. I looked at some of the interviews with the author, and they asked him about this question. Was it a conflict, of he didn't believe in slavery, but yet he had a slave. And when the author was writing the book, he said that he didn't really write about the fact that he had a slave, but he did write about his freedom. And when he got sick and when he died, he had been treated at the Pennsylvania hospital. And actually, Benjamin Rush paid for his funeral when he died. So even though he didn't talk about it, he took care of him. I don't know if that helps at all, but so that's all we know about that part of it.
Actually, that reminds me that there's one mistake I made about George Washington's will. There was one slave who was 55 years old at the time he wrote his will, which was pretty old at the time, if you were a slave to be that old. And he says in his will, as to this guy, I forget his name, I'm leaving it up to you. If you want to stay a slave till you die, you could stay where you are and you'll be taken care of at that point. Or if you decide you're free, you're free. Okay. And so there was one exception to the rule that applied to everybody else.
I found the parts of the book that talked about mental health and the asylums and the changes in treatment at that time, and his pushing for more humane treatment to be very interesting. And I just wondered if anybody else felt that way or had a comment on that.
Oh, I agree. I think, he really started more humane care.
Martha, turn your voice up a little bit. Your volume is low.
I just have to come closer. And then and whatever. Now I've forgotten what I was saying. He did.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Well, you can't hear me. He really did start the more humane care for the mentally ill, and he was sure that it was a disease that could be cured, and I'm not sure that anybody else at that time felt that way. And of course, Rush Medical Center in Philadelphia which is part of the University of Pennsylvania, is named for him. So since that was my field, public health, I've heard of that and heard of him for a long time as a highly respected. But I thought one of the interesting things when he was a young man to have so much information about all the women he was interested in, and it's just amazing that he hasn't been written about before because of all these little details that they were able to find about him. I found that very intriguing. I don't know if Mary Keenan has any comments on just the way the book was put together and where they were able to find all this research.
I thought one of the most interesting parts was how he reconciled Jefferson and Adams.
Yeah.
And how Adams was asked to write first and he wasn't sure, and then he sent a letter with 2 pieces of homespun that turned out to be the writings of Josiah Quincy, and Jefferson mistook that and thought he was sending some manufactured goods and wrote that long treatise. But I was so intrigued with the friendship with Adams and Jefferson and how he handled it that I went to my Friends Divided book by Gordon Wood, and Gordon says that Abigail was really an impediment in their friendship because right after Jefferson had been elected, the new president wasn't inaugurated until March, and Abigail made the mistake of not being cordial to Jefferson and to expressing her own opinion about Democrats who would be taking over the presidency. And Freed doesn't seem to get Abigail involved. But anyway, I thought that was a fascinating part. And I had no idea that their correspondence was so esoteric, talking about dreams and all of that.
One of my favorite pieces, I forget if it's at Monticello or the National Archives, there's a letter, I believe it was from Jefferson to Rush inviting him to a dinner party, and it's signed Tommy, and I just love that.
Goodness, Tommy.
I don't think of him as a Tommy.
I know, right?
Oh, Thomas.
Tommy.
Yeah.
Mm.
I also found it interesting that he was a brilliant man, but he sort of put in writing things he shouldn't have. The whole situation with Washington. I mean, he wanted to gain Washington's favor, and yet he wrote that letter to Patrick Henry, and it was
You know, that's probably part of his problem too, why he is the forgotten founding father, because he did write so much that people did not want to hear.
Oh, can you imagine if he lived today?
Wow.
He'd be on the internet all the time. He would be another Trump, just writing these things.
He might give Trump a run for his money.
He would. He would. I
Yeah.
mean, he just didn't stop to think.
Mm-mm.
And he put things in writing that shouldn't have been put in writing. You know, save it, write it down and put it aside and wait a couple days.
Mhm.
He didn't do that.
It's like the emails I write when I'm mad that I never send.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Mhm.
Yeah, he was like a Forrest Gump. He was everywhere where men of influence and power were. And of course, as an old Navy man, I love what he tried to do for the soldiers and the health of the soldiers via Washington by suggesting how the soldiers were to be conducting themselves, not to eat so much. Another thing that he said is they should keep their hair cut very short and so forth. And I was interested in the comment because Revolutionary War around here, the British had a very sophisticated medical system, if you will.
Mhm.
And I guess you should say, well, why not? They were like we are now. We have a sophisticated medical system for our combat soldiers. Why? Because we're everywhere and we need to do that. But even back then, he took a lot of his ideas about how medicine should be practiced by the Revolutionary Army and made sure that Washington knew about them. And Washington, although it was rather convoluted just because of the way he was, many of his ideas were adopted by Washington. So that was helpful to the cause.
Yeah.
But I think if we sat down to talk with him, you'd be exhausted. You'd almost say, Benjamin, will you please shut up?
Yeah.
I'd like
Pause.
to talk. Yeah.
ADHD.
There you go.
Mhm.
Anybody else, anything else about Benjamin Rush in the book you found interesting that you'd like to bring up that we haven't talked about?
Oh,
I have go ahead.
No, I was just struck by his oldest son. I just felt so badly for him.
Oh, yeah.
Just his whole life. And I wondered how much what happened with him was caused by the fact that, first of all, his father had no father. And the fact that he was the oldest son, that he was led along expecting to follow in his father's footsteps when perhaps that was not what he was ever meant to be.
Yeah, too much pressure on him as the oldest son.
And that just, his whole story, that was, to me, was the saddest part of the whole thing.
Yeah, it was.
And the excruciating punishment that was given them for playing cards on a Sunday night.
Oh, yes.
Wasn't he removed from the college?
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah, the college was very humane about the whole thing.
And was willing to forgive him, but Rush said, no, 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 you have made this grievous mistake. And I can see why the young man went off the rails.
Yeah. And there you've got the father who had not had a father, who was, just kind of unreasonable.
Yes.
I don't know.
Who didn't know how to roll with the punches.
Yeah, he didn't.
I was very surprised at everything this man did. He just did everything. And in one, maybe 2 to 3 paragraphs in the book, the author says that he encouraged people to study diseases in animals. So that was the beginning of veterinary medicine. He encouraged an amphitheater to watch surgery, which then became commonplace later. He encouraged a separate hospital for the mentally ill, and started the American Psychiatric Association. This was in like 3 paragraphs of the book. it's just amazing how much he accomplished.
It is.
Yes, it. Speaking of John Adams, the author, there's a beautiful quote about Benjamin that I can share with you because I thought it was great. This is a quote from a letter that John Adams wrote after Benjamin Rush died, and he wrote it to his son, Richard. And he said, Dr. Rush was a greater and better man than Dr. Franklin, yet Rush was always persecuted and Franklin was always adored. Rush has done infinitely more good to America than Franklin. Both had deserved a high rank among benefactors to their country and mankind, but Rush by far the highest. That's a pretty good tribute from John Adams
Yeah.
to,
Mhm.
and then they kind of, in one interview, they asked the author, what do you think Rush would say about that? And the author said that Rush really was Franklin's protege. He adored him. And in Franklin's later years, he said that Rush made certain that more people paid attention to Franklin, even then when he'd seemed too sick or too old. So the author says he thinks that that Rush wanted to be the next Benjamin Franklin, or the next Benjamin after Franklin died. He sees him as a scientist, a teacher, a writer, and the author thinks Franklin would admit that had they had a chance to kind of follow up with each other. So there's a good thought for you.
Hmm.
I think people always forget that Franklin wasn't actually a doctor. He was one of those people that got a doctorate and never let anybody forget about it. I think it's an honorary doctorate too.
Exactly.
Those people.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts about the book? Dick, do you have anything else you wanted to add? You've done such a great job with bringing out all this wonderful information.
No, it was kind of a summary of things that were of interest to me and a few things I learned. And the guy did a lot of things, as others have said. I mean, he wrote, he was a doctor, he was in politics, he was, he did a lot of things. Yeah, most of us wind up doing one or two things. He did a lot more.
And it was really great to find out all of this information, because I don't know if any of you, I didn't really know anything about Benjamin Rush.
I'd never heard of him before.
No.
I do remember.
I was
Well-
surprised that
Yeah.
in the 1760s, he was at the University of Edinburgh and then at London hospitals. I mean, to think that back then they were doing overseas training was just amazing.
Yeah, right.
True. Anything else anybody want to bring up? Have we covered everything? Any unanswered questions?
Yes,
Marjorie.
I have a long-standing interest in Lewis and Clark, and I was fascinated that all the stuff I've read I didn't put together that it was Dr. Rush to whom Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis to get all the background for the trek. I just thought that was different, and it was something that was of special interest to me.
There you go.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Good point.
it was just a page or two in the book. Yeah. But it was, if somebody else had done it, there'd be, because he wouldn't have done so many things.
Headlines.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wish his initiative with mental health had gone somewhere.
Yeah.
Because he had no follow-up champion, it appears.
Yeah.
Or if he did, they died out in the next generation. And we went through the 19th century treating the mentally ill just as people had treated them before his ideas.
The
Right.
19th and a good piece of the 20th.
Indeed, yes. Yeah.
Except for Dorothea Dix, who did push for better treatment in the 19th century.
Well, 40 years ago or 50 years ago, we had 400,000 people locked up whose crime was they were mentally ill.
Yeah, you're right.
We're now down to about 50,000. Now that has created some other problems because some people go off their medication and they do something which is perceived irrational.
Yeah.
And what the citizens do, they call the cops.
Yeah.
And the cops are supposed to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Well, historically, cops weren't supposed to deal with mentally ill people. They're dealing with criminals and so forth. So they've had to be given training to deal with it, and the training is insufficient. I can assure you, as somebody that has sued cops and sued towns for failure to train cops for that reason. So
It was really sad to hear about how horrible they were treated in that Pennsylvania hospital.
God, yeah.
Oh, it was just awful. I mean, thank God someone like him at least tried to bring it to the surface and tried to help them, but it just wasn't the time, I suppose.
But when you
No
think
one wanted to treat them as human beings.
But nobody, it continues, that same type of treatment or non-treatment, locking them up, continued for another 100, 150 years.
Yeah.
But look at the state of medicine in those days. I
Yeah.
was appalled with what Nabby Adams had to go through for her breast cancer.
Oh,
I mean, that just, ah,
oh,
I know.
It
So-
took time. For reading things.
Anything else anybody wants to bring up? Anybody else have any other thoughts about Benjamin that any
I
interest
think,
of any passage in the book?
I think the previous speaker who mentioned, I'm sorry, I don't see your name, said how in a few paragraphs, all these wonderful things that Rush did were mentioned. It seemed that the author gave equal weight to everything, and that the larger contribution should have been emphasized more. I think of the phrase of, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter book. That I think there was so much little detail, not about little things, but about less important things that he could have emphasized. He could have put his emphasis in a little different place.
Good point.
It's one of those people that you could write about, we look at Washington and there's books on Washington and spies, and there's books on Washington and the war and Washington and this and that and the other thing. This is a guy who you could pick out and really pinpoint and specialize and write a whole book about all these different things.
Yeah. Anything else anybody wants to talk about? Any other part of the book?
Well, I was surprised at the number of children he had, the number of times his wife got pregnant. It just never seemed to end. And unfortunately, some of the babies died, but that was impressive. And I was also surprised at his neighborhood where he lived, because it seemed he moved all the time.
yeah.
From one house to another, to a big house, and the houses all had extra houses with them and outdoor kitchens and places for his office. I'd like to see that neighborhood. It must have been wonderful. And all the different farms he had, and they're always moving and buying property.
And why? Why was he always, it wasn't clear. Sometimes it was clear why they moved, but sometimes it wasn't.
Right.
And personally, I would not care to move that much.
There's one other, I'm not sure if it was in the book or from the author, or I tend to read off the scope sometimes, but where both of the Benjamins are buried at the Christ Church burial ground. It said that when Rush died, Rush's burial was second only to Washington's burial and Franklin's burial.
Ooh.
So somebody thought of him and buried him very close to the other Franklin.
Yeah. Good. Good to know.
Anything anyone else wants to add? Wow, that was great. thank you so much to our hostess with the mostest. That was really great. Sue, I'll turn it back to you, and thank you so much for coming, everyone. And Sarah, thank you so much too.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for doing the technology for us. Otherwise, we'd be in deep stuff.
We sure would. If
We
you,
have
you
to
put
rely on us.
Sue and I together, we're still out here on the technical scope.
Right, right. Anyway, thank you, Dick, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. Our next book is Boston Massacre, A Family History, and we will have the author with us to lead the group on December 8th. So we hope to see you all then. In the meantime,
Bring your
please
friends. Yeah.
stay well. Yep. Let your friends know about this. You don't have to get dressed up.
None of us know what you're wearing on the bottom.
That's right. That's right.
Bring your glass of wine.
So thank you all very much, and we'll
Thank
see you
you.
next time. In the meanwhile, please stay well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, stay
you.
healthy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you in
Nice.
December.
Nice to see
This
you
was
all.
great. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue.
Thank you.
Bye, Sarah.
Bye.